Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a truly fascinating, deeply interconnected map of our modern world. We're going to be unpacking the 2026 global risk landscape. And honestly, what we are about to see is a massive, real-time demonstration of the butterfly effect. We're going to explore how seemingly isolated events in one tiny corner of the globe are literally triggering a massive chain reaction of crises across completely different continents and sectors. So get ready, because the sheer scale of how these dominoes are falling is absolutely incredible.
Okay, let's dive right into this with a question that perfectly captures this whole butterfly effect idea. How does a conflict in the Middle East end up turning the lights out on islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? I mean, it sounds like the setup to a riddle, right? But it's exactly what's unfolding in early 2026. To really understand the overarching narrative of this global crisis chain, we first have to look at the arteries of global trade. And it all boils down to this number right here, 20%. Right now, a staggering 20% of all global seaborne oil passes through one single, highly vulnerable choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz. With recent conflict-driven blockages in the strait over the past month, the global supply chain has taken a massive shock. And here's the thing, when the flow of energy stops here, the ripples are felt most severely by the people who are furthest away from the source.
Which brings us to the Pacific Islands. These nations sit at the absolute furthest end of the global supply chain, and they rely almost entirely on imported diesel just to keep their economies running. It's a pretty brutal paradox, honestly. The nations furthest from the conflict are the ones immediately fighting for basic survival. Just look at the real-world impact right now. Tuvalu has actually declared a state of emergency amid daily blackouts. Over in Fiji, which is a major regional fuel distribution hub, the government is out there warning citizens against panic buying. The Marshall Islands, they've declared a 90-day economic emergency, and Vanuatu is bracing for some incredibly steep electricity price hikes. So, a geopolitical choke point half a world away has instantly created a crisis of basic affordability and power survival for these isolated nations. But the shockwaves definitely don't stop there. Let's see how this builds, because this exact same shipping and energy choke point is simultaneously causing massive ripples thousands of miles in the complete opposite direction. We're talking right into the U.S. agricultural sector. Now, you might think farmers in the American Midwest are completely insulated from Middle Eastern maritime routes, but the 2026 commodity markets tell a completely different, highly interconnected story. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the unique tug-of-war happening right now for U.S. farmers. Usually, when energy costs rise, global commodity prices rise too, and that kind of cushions the blow for agriculture. But in 2026, we have a structural trade headwind, specifically tariffs and lost market share abroad, that's blocking that normal relief. At the exact same time, though, we have a biofuel tailwind right at home, where those same high oil prices are driving up domestic demand for ethanol and biodiesel. Let's break down both sides of this equation. First up, the headwind. So, despite a late 2025 bilateral agreement where China committed to buying at least 25 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans annually, there's still a residual 10% supplemental tariff in place. And this tariff wedge makes U.S. exports more expensive. So what happens? Brazil steps in. They've cemented structural dominance as the top supplier to China. That effectively blocks the normal export price transmission that usually helps U.S. farmers survive an energy shock, and it caps their profit potential abroad. But here is the tailwind saving the day. In a really strange twist of fate, the very oil shock hurting the rest of the world is actually serving as a critical price floor for U.S. corn and soybeans. High crude oil prices from that Middle East conflict make domestic biofuels incredibly competitive. Plus, the Environmental Protection Agency finalized new mandates for 2026 that project a record 60% increase in domestic biodiesel and renewable diesel production. Because this demand is legally binding and entirely domestic, it completely bypasses those tariff-blocked export channels, keeping American markets afloat amid all the global chaos. So we've seen the microeconomic impacts, right? From rolling blackouts in Tuvalu to biofuel margins in the U.S. heartland. But as these economic and energy pressures mount globally, they act as an accelerant for existing conflicts. Now we need to shift our focus to the macro-level humanitarian fallout, relying on the latest data from the International Rescue Committee. Just take a second to absorb this staggering statistic. An overwhelming 89%. That is the amount of global humanitarian need in 2026 concentrated in just 10 crisis countries. Let that sink in. It means that nearly all of the world's displacement, extreme hunger, and human suffering is densely packed into a tiny fraction of the globe's most fragile nations, places that represent only 12% of the global population. Let's look objectively at the top 5 countries on the IRC's watch list for 2026. In Sudan, you have a deadlocked civil war that's left 19.2 million people facing severe food insecurity. In the occupied Palestinian territory, extensive conflict has triggered the total collapse of healthcare, along with the displacement of 90% of the population. South Sudan is facing the very stark risk of renewed civil war, which is being compounded by the disruption of its vital oil exports. Over in Ethiopia, they're struggling under a destabilizing peace deal and massive international aid cuts. And in Haiti, armed gang control of the capital has displaced 1.4 million civilians. In every single one of these cases, conflict and displacement are the primary drivers pushing these nations toward record hunger and systemic collapse. So, with such an intense concentration of human suffering, the obvious question you have to ask is, why are these crises multiplying and intensifying so rapidly right now? To really understand the fuel being poured on these fires, we need to zoom out even further and look at the broader geopolitical risk matrix compiled by the Council on Foreign Relations. So the crucial point here really comes down to the CFR's Tier 1 risks. These are events assessed as having both a high likelihood of occurring in 2026 and a high impact on U.S. and global security. This assessment is completely neutral and data-driven, highlighting severe threats across multiple regions. In the Middle East, there's a high risk of renewed fighting in Gaza and escalation in the West Bank. In Eastern Europe, they note an intensification of infrastructure attacks in the Russia-Ukraine war. And in the Americas, the assessment outlines high risks ranging from potential U.S. strikes targeting criminal groups in Venezuela to the threat of growing domestic political violence and popular unrest within the United States itself. When we map all these concurrent risks out on a timeline, it's literally like watching dominoes fall. Look at this. In late 2025, trade tensions with China persist, and foreign policy experts are simultaneously warning of 30 plausible global conflicts. By early 2026, conflict disrupts the Strait of Hormuz. Within months, that disruption triggers economic emergencies in the Pacific Islands, forces the U.S. farm sector to lean heavily on domestic biofuels, and severely exacerbates the fragile humanitarian situations monitored by the IRC. Everything is connected. Trade, energy, conflict, and climate. They are all feeding into one continuous, escalating loop of global risk. Which leads us to a really vital question as we wrap up our explainer today. With conflicts spreading across the globe, supply chains breaking down, and humanitarian crises reaching catastrophic levels, where exactly is the international community? Where is the global governance that's meant to step in and mediate these exact scenarios? Well, according to the Security Council report, the reality at the United Nations is pretty stark. The UN Security Council is currently paralyzed by some of its deepest internal divisions since the post-Cold War era. You've got major powers locked in mutual recriminations, constantly accusing each other of violating international law. And because of this gridlock, diplomatic progress has just completely stalled on massive crises like Haiti, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, and Ukraine. And to make matters even worse, a severe liquidity crisis, driven by member states failing to pay their dues, has forced the UN into hiring freezes and reduced humanitarian services, exactly when the world needs them the absolute most. This dynamic stands in painful contrast to the ideal purpose of the institution. Just listen to how UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres pleaded with member states. He said, "Choose peace rooted in international law. The UN is a guardian of international law." But as we've seen through all the data today, that guardianship is currently struggling under the immense weight of geopolitical fragmentation and severely constrained resources. So what does this all mean for us? We are left with a landscape where an energy choke point can bankrupt a Pacific island. A tariff can completely reshape American agriculture, and 89% of all humanitarian suffering is trapped in just a handful of nations, all while the world's primary diplomatic body is fundamentally gridlocked. With the UN divided and the butterfly effect of 2026's conflict spreading faster than ever, who steps in to break the chain of crises? It's a complex, deeply challenging question, but understanding these connections is the first step toward finding an answer. Thanks for exploring this with me today. Keep learning and keep asking those big questions.